a fact is not always a truth. When the earth was flat, that was a fact. Because everybody abided by that fact. And everybody believed that fact. At least in Europe. But it wasn't the truth. So now I'll give you my differentiation. The tongue and the hands. And the tongue and the hands, and that, please don't think that that overrides your answers, because all of your answers were correct. And I applaud you for offering them. So now let's focus on today's theme, which is about mantra, the tongue, and the hands. First of all, you were an embryo, and that's known as the flower bud, and then you blossomed into the fetus, okay, in the womb. As an embryo, the cells that were producing both the brain and the hands were in the exact same area of the embryo. And if you look at an embryo that has been drawn upon to show how the petals of the bud emerge, you will find that the embryo is actually holding its brain. So the connection between the brain and the hands begins at the very beginning, and it continues throughout our life. And that's why when we're doing mantra, man means mind and tra means projection. So when we're projecting from the universal mind, there's a connection between the brain, which has the immediate access to mind, and the hands. So you put your hands in a particular mudra, and all of a sudden that connection that took place in the very origins of your physical body are reconnected. The tongue. The strongest muscle group, because it's a group, in the entire body, and the most complex muscle group in the entire body is the tongue, is the human tongue. Now that isn't true with other animals. The complexity of the tongue, 17 unique muscle groups, and every muscle group in our body, plus every gland, plus every organ, plus every bone, is housed in a net of fascia. And those connections between the net bags, it's almost like, you know, those laundry bags that you have that you can pack away, and they're like, they look like a net. And those nets are all held in place around one central adhesion. And that central adhesion is your navel point. The navel point is the only pre-surgical adhesion. I mean, those who have had surgery oftentimes have other adhesions. Adhesion is just like that. It's adhering to something. And basically an adhesion is usually where the internals of the body is adhered to the outer surface of the body. So your navel point is that central adhesion around which all fascia is connected. And Yogi Bhajan used to say, otherwise, when you drove around a sharp corner, everything would slosh to the sides and then get all tangled up, and you know, pre-automobile humans would have been really great, and then post-automobile humans would have been really weird. And then somebody said, but that's the way it is. And he said, well, that's because of other reasons. So every one of these 17 unique muscle groups inside the tongue has the ability. The only other thing in animal worlds that is similar to the human tongue are the ears of the canines and the felines, right? Have you ever checked out how many different positions they can put those things in, you know? And you got one position, you know, it's like, What's that? If you need to hear better, you put your hand up there, right? But they just go, oh. So this tongue has been developing in this way for hundreds of millions of years. The mammalian brain, which produced this tongue, the brain of mammals, the mammalian brain, began at about 350 million years ago. And the mammals laid in the background because there was the dominant of the reptilians, the dinosaurs and all. They were the dominant species, the reptilians, which were cold-blooded, yes? And what do you say about somebody that's not nice? You're cold-blooded. Cold-blooded means that it actually doesn't have a relationship with others. And so the heart center in a cold-blooded animal only has a relationship with self. So the reptilian form that we've all passed through was for the purpose of gaining access to self. Because you have to. You have to gain access to self in order to express, and then ultimately in order to surrender. You can't surrender if you have nothing to surrender. And that is a whole nother conversation, because that's what's happening in today's world. Today's world of massive aggression is about achieving that ultimate sense of self, which will ultimately then sublimate into a significant surrender if all goes well. So this tongue was developing. Now, one time I was told by Yogi Bhajan to build a shed behind where he was living at the time, which is Guru Ram Das Ashram across the street in Dallaville. So I'm building this shed. I've got my wood, I've got a table saw, I've got all kinds of stuff back there, and I'm building this shed. About 7 hours into building this shed, he comes out and says, "You're still building the shed?" It's like, you should have had 10 sheds built by now. Stimulation. Let me help you. If you ever have a moment when your teacher says something that you just wish was not the case, this was that moment. Because if you've ever been working, with wood, and somebody that has never worked with wood says, "Let me help you," usually you can say, "No, that's okay." But you don't say, "No, that's okay," to your teacher. You just say, "Excellent." So the next job that I had to do, I forgot something. He starts becoming the boss. Okay? Put this here, put this here, put this here. And I'm going like this, I'm going like this. And then I run out of things that are pre-cut, and I have to cut a 4x8 sheet of plywood on the table saw. Well, a 4x8 sheet of plywood cut on a table saw is best done with one person. Because one person cannot bind the wood. But a second person will pull the wood or push the wood in a direction other than the first person, and that is the grounds for disaster. Right? So, Yogi Bhajan says, "Okay, let me be the one that pushes the wood." And I say, "Okay, well then that means that I'm going to be one that pulls the wood, and what I would like you to do is not actually push the wood." Because I can pull the wood, and the table saw is turning towards him, right? So the direction of the blade is towards him, and I'm pulling the wood, keeping the two pieces of wood that are coming out of the table saw enough separated so that it doesn't bind. And the one thing that the person pushing the wood cannot do is push harder on one hand than the other, because that will bind against the side of the blade, which is, again, grounds for disaster. I said, okay, sir, please just have your hands on the wood, but don't push. That lasted for maybe 14 seconds. So we're, and I'm thinking, this is going well. This is going well. And then all of a sudden, I have a hold of the wood, and all of a sudden, I don't have a hold of the wood anymore, because it has flown at about 60 miles an hour in the opposite direction, and it catches Yogi Bhajan in the navel point, and he goes like this, and falls on his back. I can't see him because the deck of the table saw is hiding my view of him, and I think, oh my God, I've killed the teacher. Because there's no sound, there's no movement. But what came out of his mouth was what was so perfect. What would come out of most people's mouths is with a big expletive. And all of a sudden, there's movement on the other side of the table saw, and I think, oh, thank God. You know, there's no 911, but I was about to load him into my car. So he sits up, he folds his hands in easy pose. He's got this piece of plywood all tracked up against him. And he looks at me and he says, good advice. He was so calm and so neutral.
Wow.
Good advice. And that was the only time in the entire history of my relationship with him while in body that he ever told me good advice. What came out of his mouth was that which he was inclined towards. And that is why we continuously chant mantras called Nam Simran, repeating mantra. Because when it comes to that moment when there is something going to happen, and also particularly to that moment after which nothing is going to happen, the moment of your passing, that which you are to be inclined towards should be that which is the highest frequency that you can utter with your tongue and your heart from your lungs and your diaphragm. So that whole mechanism which got triggered by that plywood smacking him in the belly, that needs to be something like, oh my God, or wahiguru, or wow, or whatever, but it needs to be an enthusiastic exclamation that helps to traject you from. Don't worry if your phone is ringing. When you hear the bells up here, you think, oh, meditative sounds. No, it's calls and texts coming in. So just a word of advice, mask them so nobody, everybody goes, oh wow, instead of turn off your phone, right? So this tongue has been developing all the time that we have been developing the head brain. And the head brain, as we said, has been developing long before mammals. So the head brain has been developing since the beginning of life on Earth about 3.5 billion years ago. And the head brain developing throughout that time is all about the survival of the species so that the species can evolve in order to plant you into those differentiations that all of you spoke of earlier. The differentiations of what is the human. And the human is the one that can that can